thousands of soldiers were killed during the American Civil War. But what happened to their children? Initially, only one northern state took on the task of caring for the Civil War orphans. Prior to the war, there were few private orphanages who cared for around 900 children. An orphan child had no place to turn, only almshouses where they had to work for room and board. After the war, the number of orphans jumped to an estimated 15,000. Both in the rural areas of Pennsylvania as well as the cities, widows were left destitute, unable to care for themselves, let alone their children, creating half-orphans. Thousands of youngsters were suddenly on their own. They were dubbed street urchins or ragamuffins. In 1863, the Philadelphia Inquirer described the events of a reception for the famous minister, Henry Ward Beecher, where Governor Andrew Curtin called upon the citizens to come to the aid of the Civil War orphans. Later, the governor claimed that his inspiration came from a chance meeting. On Thanksgiving Day, he heard a knock on the front door of the executive mansion. Opening the door, he discovered two small children, a boy and his sister, clad in rags, shivering and begging for food. They said that their father had been killed in battle and that their mother had just died. Curtin exclaimed, "Is it possible that the people of Pennsylvania can feast this day while the children of her fallen soldiers beg bread from door to door?" In 1864, through Curtin's efforts, private boarding schools for the soldiers' orphans were created. Few know about this forgotten history, the notorious scandals, sorrows and successes which acted as a springboard for ongoing orphan care in Pennsylvania, ultimately changing the lives of thousands of veterans' children. Among all the governors of the northern states, none more strongly supported the Union cause than Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania. The dean of modern Pennsylvania historians wrote, "The heroic role of Andrew Gregg Curtin stands head and shoulders above all the other governors of the loyal states as a tremendous wartime leader." Curtin tried to ease the life of the soldiers once they went to the front lines. A special state agency was set up in Washington, D.C. to look after the needs of Pennsylvania soldiers. State agents were sent into the field to make sure the sick and wounded received proper care. Curtin started the practice of returning bodies to the soil of their native state and proposed a national cemetery at Gettysburg. It is also said that he was determined to fulfill his promise to look after the widows and children of the fallen. Curtin personally went to the front lines to visit the troops and the wounded in the hospitals. Governor Curtin won the devotion of the Pennsylvania troops. He was hailed as the soldiers' friend. Once Governor Curtin made known his desire to help the soldiers' orphans, the actual founding was anticlimactic. The legislature gave their approval to aid the children. Orphans would be placed in private institutions using a $50,000 gift from the Pennsylvania Railroad. In 1866, the legislature passed another bill appropriating $300,000 for the schools. Finally, in 1867, the legislature gave its final approval and set up a state agency to oversee the private schools where the orphans had been placed. He ended his official association with the schools in 1867. In 1881, at a reunion of the alumni of the schools, a journalist reported that tears coursed down the cheeks of the former governor as he looked upon the faces of those he had found in cellar and garret. Andrew Gregg Curtin must be given most of the credit for the establishment of the Soldiers' Orphan Schools of Pennsylvania. A well-defined hierarchy of officials regulated the lives of the soldiers' orphans. They were real schoolmen and not humanitarians. At the top of the pyramid was the state superintendent of the soldiers' orphans. He prescribed the rules and regulations for the schools, approved the admission of the children, and visited the schools. All four men who filled this position were veteran educators. Thomas Henry Burroughs, the first superintendent, and James Pyle Wickersham were probably the most famous educators of the day in Pennsylvania. Also educators, George McFarland and lastly, Elisha Higby. Two other members of the Central Department, a man and a woman, were the inspectors. They visited the schools to see if the superintendent's mandates were being carried out. The most interesting of the inspectors was Elizabeth E. Hutter. At 17, she married Edwin Hutter, who became Secretary of State James Buchanan's private secretary in Washington, D.C. Mrs. Hutter was described as a star of Washington society. Then tragedy struck when their 2 sons died of scarlet fever. They moved to Philadelphia, where Edwin became a minister and Elizabeth founded an orphanage, the Northern Home for Friendless Children. When the Civil War started, both went to the front to help the wounded, even receiving a special train from President Lincoln to go to Gettysburg in 1863. Mrs. Hutter remained an inspector for years, up until the scandal erupted. At the central office in Harrisburg, there were 3 male clerks who kept the record book. Here the dominant figure was Colonel James L. Paul. He wrote a history of soldiers' orphan schools in 1873. Colonel Paul was accused in the 1880s of profiting from the infamous syndicate, to which he assigned the pupils. He was fired due to his alleged role in the scandal. Once the program began, those who were in charge were quick to justify the system. They stressed 3 arguments. First, it was necessary to demonstrate that orphans were a social menace. The orphans were pictured as coming from an environment of neglect and want, not from homes of ignorance and vice. The children arrived at the schools in such a miserable state. They were covered with vermin and infected with disease. They were ignorant, very dull, and stupid. Worst of all was their moral character. They possessed moral deformities, disobedience, quarrelsomeness, lying, idleness, and kindred vices. Practically all used foul language, some addicted to tobacco. School records referred to individual delinquents. One boy was known as a Pittsburgh rat, the most unpromising of boys. The second part of their argument: what would happen if the child did not continue to receive the saving grace of the Commonwealth? The word was crime. They proclaimed that a homeless child, if left to his own devices, would grow up not a plague to himself but a nuisance to society. They would probably end up on the gallows. Superintendent Burroughs stated, of the 1,510 convicted criminals in New York, 627 were orphans or half-orphans. In Pennsylvania, 516 out of 962, or more than half, were virtually orphans. In Maryland, out of 537 convicts, 260 were orphans. Finally, there was the economics of law enforcement. Although thousands of dollars were being spent on the orphans, this was a small expenditure compared with the millions that the state was saving on police protection and prison internment. If it had not been for the schools, the state would be spending 10 times over on jails and penitentiaries. Certainly, it was better to spend the money on educating the children to become good citizens rather than for crime protection or to build penitentiaries. If they had the facilities, existing organizations admitted the soldiers' orphans under the new program, while other orphanages such as the Lincoln Institute in Philadelphia were created. Major General George Meade was the school's first president. Said of the general, his energy and aid contributed to bringing about the remarkable result that in 9 weeks the money was raised, the house was bought, and the work begun. And the eye that had witnessed the self-sacrifice of the fathers never faltered in its watchfulness for the welfare of the children. Some of the schools initially started in private homes or as a humanitarian effort. In 1863, Emanuel and Christiana Buringer opened the Shepherd of the Lambs Orphanage in their own home at 702 Morris Street in Philadelphia. The number of children quickly grew, and the orphanage moved to Bridesburg, then later, renamed Bethany, to Womelsdorf. The majority of schools were located in extremely rural areas. These locations were justified in terms of fresh air and water. The Uniontown School in the Allegheny Mountains was selected so the children could breathe pure air and drink pure mountain water. At the Mercer School, nature's sweet and vocal system inhabit the grove. Hartford School was an elevated one on the spine of the Blue Mountains. The Bridgewater School, created for the colored soldiers' orphans, was beautifully located on the Delaware, easily reached by boat. These locations were planned to deal with several challenges, from financial considerations to the perceived problem of the interference of the mothers. The rural locations made for difficult travel for the mothers. To get to the Dayton school, a mother must take the Allegheny Valley Railroad to Kittinig, then travel by stagecoach another 22 miles. Another benefit of the rural locations, it made it hard for an unhappy student to run away, which was a great embarrassment for officials. Once a young orphan arrived, they quickly knew that they had entered a well-regulated existence. Everything was done by the tap of a bell and was obeyed with soldier-like precision. The purpose of these schools was schooling and not benefice care. Superintendent Burroughs set up a complicated educational plan which seemed to have been followed faithfully for the 25-year history of the schools. Closely tied to intellectual training was the emphasis on military drills. Every institution had its corps of cadets who went through maneuvers on the school's parade ground. If the need should arise, the orphans would be ready to respond as their fathers had in 1862. Girls received calisthenics and performed dance programs as their form of physical training. But it was character education that mattered the most. To know what was morally good was more important than being intelligent if one could not be both. As to clothing, each of the boys wore a facsimile of the uniform of their deceased father. Most of the clothing were sewn up by the older girls in the sewing room. After breakfast each morning the orphans were inspected. Woe to the child who was missing a button or had failed to shine his shoes. He lost his play privilege for the day. Most of the schools had musical programs. The band at Chester Springs consisted of 13 pieces and was conducted by a teacher from Philadelphia. A field trip was exciting. The most famous was in 1865. 345 orphans were brought to Harrisburg and marched from the railway station to the Capitol building, loudly cheered by the crowd. The highlight of each year was the annual examination. This was a public event, and hundreds would attend, newspaper editors, mothers, and Grand Army members. The examination was completely oral and was more entertainment than a test. For over 20 years, the schools were described as one of the most successful philanthropic undertakings in the history of the state. February 22, 1886, the tabloid Philadelphia Record headline read, "Soldiers' Orphans, a syndicate's traffic upon humanity. Official corruption, neglect, abuse." The article described how the once grand purpose of the schools was being prostituted for the sake of human greed and callous neglect. Profits as high as $50,000 a year were being rolled in by the private owners as they fed their charges for 3 cents a meal. Writer John Norris claimed it was the infamous Dotheboys Hall come to life. Like Squire Squeers of Dickens' fictional English boarding school, the proprietors of the schools, in their lust for money, had turned the state's pride into pest holes. The reaction to this revelation was swift. There were words of outrage on the front page of every newspaper. Just as vehement was the anger of the 35,000 members of the state Grand Army of the Republic. While it had never had an official connection with the system, they had always taken an active interest in the institutions and had come to feel a duty to protect the welfare of the children of their fallen comrades. Only 2 days after the original record exposure, the state commander of the Grand Army announced that he was setting up a committee to investigate the schools. The Grand Army marches against the plunderers of the orphans. Governor Pattison, although he fired the inspectors, claimed that he could do nothing about the conduct of the private schools since they were the responsibility of the state legislature. The fate of the schools was not decided until March 1889. The private schools would all be closed and a central state industrial school would be opened with a broader acceptance of students. Much of the failure can be attributed to the state officials who administered the system. They neglected to institute industrial education and failed to supervise the private school owners and became far too involved with politics and profits. And so, the Civil War Soldiers' Orphan Schools of Pennsylvania, 1864 to 1889, passed into history. For the most part, forgotten. But it surely reveals the patriotism and humanitarianism of the state. For the first time in the history of the nation, a government took on the care of veterans' children. The original spirit and intent of Curtin's program lived on at the Scotland Industrial School, where children were given institutional care by the state until 2009.